Hello and welcome. You're listening to Rogue Resistance, a podcast in support of ORD2 Indivisible. I'm your host, Rhonda Nowak. Fellow Oregonians, I want to tell you in no uncertain terms, we are living through an authoritarian takeover of American democracy. It's not teetering on the edge, it's not at risk. Authoritarian governance is happening right now, and corruption is its weapon of choice. Today, I'm discussing local historian and author Jeffrey LeLande's book, The Jackson County Rebellion. Jeff tells the little known but fascinating story of political corruption right here in the Rogue Valley during the 1930s, an era when demagogues exploited lies about government graft to seize power, and the public found itself caught between propaganda and reality. Sound familiar? What happened in Jackson County nearly a century ago isn't just dusty history. It's a warning flare that the same forces we see in Autocracy Inc. can take root right in our own backyard. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for talking with me today.
I'm pleased to be here, Rhonda.
Before we dive into the broader themes, I want to give listeners a sense of the story you tell in your book. In the early 1930s, a group in Jackson County calling themselves the Good Government Congress rose to power on a wave of anti corruption rhetoric. But once in office, their leaders, orchardist and newspapermen L.A. Banks and Earl Fale, used that power for personal gain, suppressing opposition, stealing and destroying election ballots, and even inciting and perpetrating violence. It's a dramatic and disturbing chapter in Southern Oregon history. So, Jeff, what other highlights of the rebellion should be mentioned before we discuss connections to government corruption today?
Well, in my book, I go back in time to show how distinctively different Southern Oregon, especially Jackson County, was in its political and social outlook for many years, different than the rest of Oregon. The rebellion itself had roots in the earlier history of Southern Oregon. It's part of a tradition, what I call an ornery tradition here in southwestern part of the state.
What I found fascinating was that some of the contention between the people in the Rogue Valley came about because they came to Oregon from different places.
Yes, originally during the initial period of white settlement in southern Oregon, the majority of the settlers were from the lower Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, and the upper South. Both areas were heavily Southern in outlook, white supremacy, states' rights, small government, etc. And they kind of ruled the roost here, except there was a small smattering of New Englanders and New Yorkers and others in the Northeast who were largely merchants and ministers, but they're much smaller in number than they were upstate in the Willamette Valley, especially Portland and Salem. So things were definitely different here. But the big change in terms of people coming from different places arrived with the early 20th century during what's called the pear orchard boom, when the so-called orchard barons from back east, Chicago area especially, brought an entirely different social stratum to our region. And that was not without tensions between the old timers and, let's say, the much more sophisticated cosmopolitan elite, the orchard barons and all the professionals that came with them after 1905, basically, lawyers, merchants, and so forth. You have the usual tension between those two aspects, rural and urban, old and new, old timers and newcomers.
And then a lot of it seemed to have to do with the orchardists who were smaller in nature and were more individualistic and wanted to be more in control of the cash flow versus those who were more into the cooperative consignment types of marketing.
And those people that you mentioned lastly, they were part of a national system of commerce and somewhat progressive business practices.
Right. And so then you have these two orchardists slash newspaper men who come into the Rogue Valley, and they are not happy with the urban elite. They're not happy with the way the orchardists are having to sell their produce. They're not happy with a lot of things. And so they are stirring the pot, so to speak, between the different tensions that have already been around for quite some time in the area.
Yeah, those tensions you just spoke of among orchardists especially really got going in the late 20s with various federal government practices and in rural America, let's call it the old agricultural establishment, felt threatened. The main instigator of the rebellion, there were two, Earl Fell, as you mentioned, who was a local contractor and had a weekly newspaper called the Pacific Record Herald, and Llewellyn A. Banks, who was a citrus grower from Southern California, Riverside County, who came up here in the late 20s and got into the pear orchard scene here and began overturning not so much the apple cart, but the pear cart of how things were done. And Banks owned a newspaper. He bought it in 1929, just a few weeks before the Wall Street crash that was the starting point of the Great Depression. Both of those newspapers were these two gentlemen's personal voices, their mouthpieces in Southern Oregon. And they used them going right up to and beyond the border of libel and slander.
So, Jeff, how did you come to write this book?
I've got to say, this topic earned my focused interest not long after I moved here to Southern Oregon in 1969, and I began looking into it. And eventually, in the early 1990s, decided I wanted to do my PhD dissertation up at U of O. I just couldn't believe the things that were being done during this time in little old Jackson County. Later, I finally got around to revising my dissertation to turn it into this book that was published a couple years ago by Oregon State University Press. I realized as I was revising my book that the story is so much what has become the story of the nation at large in recent years. In fact, in the end of the preface, I say some readers of this book may be struck, as I have been during the course of writing it, by the parallels between political events in Depression-era Southern Oregon and the divisive, turbulent national politics of the 21st century.
Absolutely. So let's get into those parallels. Jackson County's Good Government Congress was launched under the banner of anti corruption, yet it quickly descended into ballot theft, personal gain, and even violence. How does that transformation illustrate classic political corruption, where the rhetoric of reform becomes a tool for seizing power and oftentimes wealth?
Well, that rhetoric of reform that was voiced in their newspapers and during speeches and rallies on the Jackson County courthouse steps and Grange halls and schoolhouses throughout the county during the years of 1932, 33. That rhetoric was very much, I believe, the selfish hopes of those two men, Banks and Fale. And it was a conscious put on job, although Banks would qualify as paranoid, psychotic. He was a brilliant, charismatic speaker, determined, self-certitude all the way. But he came up by his bootstraps. He was
Interesting.
from Northwestern Ohio. I think he was quite proud of his success, and he wanted to keep the orchard industry in the old way of getting paid cash for your crop rather than going on consignment and waiting for the middleman to pay you back, which could lead to good things or really bad things. depending on the market price that year. So he had various reasons to come up with this program of basically taking over the government of Jackson County.
I was struck by the same thing that you said about his personality. He had such a charismatic personality. It really does remind me a lot of Donald Trump because it ended up being a cult personality.
Yes, particularly in the rural parts of Jackson County, the people in those outlying communities, especially just outside of Medford, began to read only Banks and Fales' two newspapers. So they heard only what those two men wanted them to hear.
Mhm.
And some of them were refusing to even read the Medford Mail Tribune, which was published as the voice of order and rationality throughout this rebellious period. They thought it was corrupt and that the Tribune and its publisher, Robert Rule, were in cahoots with the people that so many hard pressed residents of Southern Oregon, not just rural, but smaller business people in the cities and small orchardists near Medford were fearing that the Mail Tribune was part of this gang, as both Banks and Fale described what is essentially the county establishment. Every county, every town, every region has an establishment that pretty much runs things. And yeah, sometimes they can be a little hard on the little guy, for sure, especially when debts are not being paid, when mortgages are being foreclosed upon because people aren't paying their debts and people are out of work. Banks were failing all over the country daily during this same period. Now, to me, this calls forth the events of the very recent past between MAGA and the parallel with the Good Government Congress, the GGC. The Banks Fail operation during the rebellion really did become cult like. And they had blindly loyal followers, followers who, even after the whole thing blew up, after Llewellyn Banks murdered a police officer sent to arrest him, and as a lot of other former members of the Good Government Congress left the organization after the killing, well, even while Banks was on trial and the other Good Government Congress defendants for the ballot theft were on trial for their part in those crimes, there were still a lot of people that remained loyal to Banks and Fale and thought they were a godsend.
Right. Now, that good government Congress was established because they were sure that the urban elites and the business elites of Medford and the Rogue Valley were corrupt. Was there any evidence that their claims had any credence at all?
I
Right,
found
right.
no evidence of some diabolical plots or massive corruption, which Banks and Fale were continually talking about, like Donald Trump did the swamp.
Thought about that too. It was so interesting that they were so adamant that this gang was corrupt. And then they ended up engaging in corruption themselves, used media, as you said, their own newspapers to amplify corruption claims and build their power.
Yes, the Banks and Fale newspapers were continually charging corruption and nefarious designs upon various portions of local law enforcement and lawyers and merchants and so forth. Whereas the Tribune steadily took a calm and rational, let's be calm, people. So many people didn't read that. They were just continually inflamed. And they would go to these rallies to become even more inflamed by the speakers like Banks and Earl Fale. Difference between the 1930s Jackson County Rebellion and today, I think, is that the culture war has become so important today.
Mhm.
That has been the way to inflame and incite anger, resentment, fear in all the old nasty ways. And it really wasn't so much a part of what Banks and Fail were doing. And I think mainly the reason for that is it was during the Great Depression, and economic dysfunction was foremost in everybody's minds. Whereas in recent years, things haven't been all that great for many of us, but it hasn't been another Great Depression.
Right.
And so we've had the luxury of getting inflamed about immigrants, sexual mores, and all that. That was not the case back in the 1930s.
I think that is an excellent point and is a very important distinction. When Banks and Fail took power, they attempted to capture county institutions and block oversight. What institutional breakdowns in Jackson County during that time mirror our current national situation?
Well, perhaps there are some aspects that mirror it, but what stands out to me is that fortunately there were two of the three county commissioners that were not part of this good government Congress movement and stood fast against it, despite threats of physical violence. Robert Rule drove his daughter to the private school she went to, the Catholic school in Medford. And he was not a Catholic, by the way, he was a Unitarian. But because the Rules were fearful of kidnapping of their daughter, things were so intense. The county commission and the judiciary fulfilled its role here. It
It's
did.
important.
Circuit court judge and others fulfilled their role, and they were not part and parcel of the good government Congress movement, this populist uprising led by Llewellyn Banks and Earl Thale. So that was a saving grace, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I kept thinking when I was reading the book how important it was that there were these separation of powers.
Yes. And the ballot theft scandal, big uproar
Yeah,
statewide.
talk.
That was over the issue of the voting results for county sheriff. The campaign for sheriff had a number of candidates in it. It was kind of a mess. The current sheriff, Ralph Jennings, was anti GGC, was a write in candidate, but the outcome was in favor of this man named Gordon Skimmerhorn, who was a Banks Fail ally and actually himself participated in the ballot theft. The idea of having the sheriff who can deputize people, allow them to carry arms under authority of law and arrest people, that was the dream for Banks and Fail.
It was a close call in that sheriff election. And so Jennings, the incumbent, who lost by just very slim margin, demanded a recount. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's been happening for so long and locally too. I thought that was so interesting. Just the whole idea of calling for a recount.
Yeah. So Skimmerhorn kind of cut his own throat by participating in the recount. And then it was soon learned that all these good government Congress officials were involved in the ballot theft from the courthouse.
So they broke into the courthouse and the vault where
Yes.
ballots were being held until the recount, and then they stole them and destroyed them. And it just seemed at that point, Banks and Fail had totally gone off the rails. I mean, they were really going rogue.
Yes, they were. It was a crazy, crazy thing to do. And it seems absolutely ludicrous, comic opera kind of stuff, tragic comic, if you will. But to have done such a thing really involves some desperate characters. And to the very end, Llewellyn Banks, after his arrest, he still firmly believed he was in the right, having shot the police officer who came to arrest him, shot him dead on his front porch.
And he was going to arrest him because he was being accused of participating in that ballot theft, right?
Yes, yes, they had finally been able to tie him with evidence to the ballot theft.
Wow,
So,
that's so interesting. I go up to Roxy and Peak quite often and am familiar with George Prescott Park. And I never knew who George Prescott was until I read your book. and realized he was a police officer right here in Medford. And he was shot and killed by Llewellyn Banks after the theft of those ballots as they were attempting to arrest Banks at his house.
And his quite large, commodious house there on the corner of West Main and Peach Street
Is it
in
still
West
there?
Medford is still there. It's been substantially modified, but it's still quite recognizable. That somewhat palatial looking home was part of the appeal of Llewellyn Banks to so many people. He was denouncing the rich, the plutocrats that had been running things under Hoover, but he himself benefited locally from this image of wealth and power that he carried with him when he moved up from California.
Wow, that all sounds so familiar too.
Drove a Cadillac, actually had two of them, dressed in very fine suits.
So, populist leadership, as we're talking about, often sells itself as fighting corruption, but sometimes they become the corruptors. What warning signs should communities watch for when reform movements begin behaving like the corrupt actors they once opposed?
Investigative journalism is really an important aspect, and that's lessening in availability and amount these days. And even when those allegedly corrupt actors castigate journalists as liars and as fake news, as is being done today, relentlessly by people like Donald Trump, it takes a certain kind of steadfastness on the part of journalists and journalistic enterprises, newspapers, networks. I sometimes wonder if we still have that steadfastness and that spine. The social fabric and the political well-being has been so corroded by many different aspects, from the postmodern distrust of science and expertise. Today everyone's got their own opinion, don't need facts, don't need science. My opinion is just as right as anybody else's because I believe it. And there you have it, right? Belief over facts, belief over rationality. And that seems to be where we're at in this country today. So I have real concerns that this country has, I sure hope it does, but whether it has the strength of bonds between quite often opposing people to try and save what is best for the good of all.
As a historian, you worked extensively with the Southern Oregon Historical Society and their records. How essential is that public memory in combating government corruption, especially when modern actors might erase or rewrite inconvenient histories?
Oh, it's crucial. Dusty old archives are worth all their weight and all the dollars to maintain them and make them open to the public. A lot of my research was done in the Jackson County archives. I didn't have to pay money to go look. I just went there and studied and paid for photocopying. I did a lot of photocopying of all these incredible criminal investigatory files of the state police and the Jackson County District Attorney's Office during the various trials that were held of GGC defendants, including Banks and Fell and others, a number of whom were sentenced to the Oregon State Penitentiary. Banks died in the state pen, actually in the state insane asylum, but he was still a prisoner, a convict, as part of the state penitentiary. Now, Earl
Okay.
Fail also went to the state pen, and he had a much shorter sentence. Banks, for the murder, got a life sentence. Fail got, I think it was 4 years in the state penitentiary. And he returned immediately upon his release to try and restart this whole deal. He was just as crazy as Llewellyn Banks was.
Right. And didn't he end up at an insane asylum?
Fail was later found legally insane. That's true. And
So they
at the
both were.
yes, they both was quite the scene in Jackson County then. The feelings were just fever hot. It was like a keg of gunpowder in the streets of Medford that were ready to explode. The digital exhibit that was put together by myself and two other people, Anna Sloan and Jan Wright at the Southern Oregon Historical Society, includes newsreel footage of some of the activities of the Good Government Congress, especially one of the rallies on the courthouse steps late in the period before things finally totally blew up in March of 1933. It was a big crowd and all the gesticulating by Earl Fell and Leland Banks up on top of the courthouse steps and a big crowd out on the lawn. It was quite an event.
Got a sneak preview of your digital exhibit, and like the book, it has fascinating photographs from that time period. And, being from this area, it's really interesting to see what the area looked like and who were the leaders during that period.
It was funded by the Oregon State Capitol Association, which is a nonprofit group that has both three-dimensional exhibits down in the lower floor beneath the rotunda of the Capitol. And there's going to be one on the Jackson County Rebellion. But this
Oh,
digital exhibit is a foretaste of that. The actual three-dimensional exhibit will have artifacts for 6 months or 9 months.
so how can people access your digital exhibit ahead of
Well,
time?
it will be made public by the Southern Oregon Historical Society through their website.
So people can go to sohs.org and find your digital exhibit on the Historical Society's website.
Yes.
Okay. This is all just so interesting. And again, I see so many parallels between what happened right here in the Rogue Valley with what is happening at the federal level. What else would you like people to know about that period in our Rogue Valley history and what it says about today?
I want to give a shout out to people like Robert Rule and other writers for the Mail Tribune and other newspapers in Oregon that commented on this episode as it was unfolding.
Yeah. As a former garden columnist for the Mail Tribune, I was always very interested in the fact that the newspaper had won a Pulitzer Prize. And I never knew why until I read your book, Jeff.
When I first moved here, that's what got me interested in this topic. There was a thing, the masthead on the Tribune used to say a Pulitzer paper or something like that. And so, what the heck is this about? And I began inquiring and starting to learn bits and pieces and went from there.
Well, I hope our local newspapers continue to make it because we certainly need independent journalists to tell us what's going on. And as we saw in the case of the Jackson County Rebellion, having more than one newspaper is also a good idea because
Yes.
you can't count on just the one newspaper to tell you the whole story. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, and thank you for writing the book.
Thanks for that, Rhonda. And thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Jeff reminds us that corruption doesn't just happen somewhere else, whether it's the Rogue Valley in the 1930s or Washington, D.C. in 2025. The mechanics of authoritarian corruption are the same. Power consolidates, oversight weakens, and loyalty gets rewarded over merit and integrity. Corruption is not just history or headlines, it's a living threat, one that adapts and resurfaces whenever we let our guard down. But history proves it doesn't have to win. In the Rogue Valley, regular folks stood up, got loud, and demanded their democracy back. Now it's our turn, this time on a national scale. Either we break the cycle or we get to live through another sequel, one that nobody asked for. Speaking of breaking the cycle, have you joined the 1 Million Rising campaign yet? Indivisible's goal is to have 1 million people actively engaged in the resistance effort every week. The last newsletter listed 50 actions you can take to fight corruption and help Americans reclaim our democracy. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rogue Resistance. There are 4 ways you can help us build this all volunteer effort. Subscribe and tune in to every episode. Like us, post a comment, and share the link on your social media. I'd love to hear what you think about Jeff LeLande's book, The Jackson County Rebellion. So until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay indivisible.